Good morning, everybody, and welcome to my Common Sense Living podcast. Today, I have an awesome individual. His name is Brandon Faust. He's a visionary owner and founder of Mold Solutions, an industry-leading indoor air quality company specializing in top-tier remediation, atomized sanitation, and duct cleaning services. He's driven by a personal journey rooted in his commitment to health and healing. His dedication stems from witnessing his own family struggle with unexplained chronic illnesses. So with that, Brandon, I'm going to let you have the floor and tell us more about how we can improve our indoor air quality.
Well, number one, thank you so much for having me on your show. I love the title, Common Sense Living. And unfortunately, common sense is one of those things that's not as common as you would expect these days, right?
I have a joke with that, common sense living, because most people don't have a common sense, and I'm full of it. And people can take that whichever way they want to.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different things that are happening in the world today, and unfortunately, we could use a lot more of that common sense. So I like to take a similar approach to a topic that is usually misunderstood. And there can be two extremes. One where somebody is terrified of mold and they're extremely cautious of every aspect of it. And then the other end of the spectrum is the person that doesn't even think there is any sort of an issue. They could, live in mold, or their tenants could live in mold, and it's no big deal. And anybody complaining about mold is sorely mistaken of it being a physical problem. And I try to keep a sort of even keel and middle ground when it comes to dealing with mold, although because my son got sick when he was a month old due to mold exposure, and I got sick from mold in 2019. And I started out as a skeptic when it came to mold. And what I mean by that is my wife had, when we moved into our house, and I'm from the West Coast, so when we moved to Tampa Bay, Florida, she suggested that we get a mold test. She had been talking to some of her friends that were moms, and they said, look, you really should get a mold test before you move into your home. And I said, I'm not interested in spending the extra $400 on that test. And lo and behold, and sure enough, she was right. We should have gotten a mold test. And, we had a home inspection done, and there were certain things that were sure signs that there probably had been a problem in the past that as a new homeowner, I did not have any real awareness of. So the fact that the bathroom behind some of the cabinets had a green board, which is a mold resistant drywall, is a sure sign that somebody probably had done a remediation project in the past. And unfortunately, when you do a remediation project, a lot of times they're not done the right way. Many of the times they're actually done by a general contractor. And the general contractor rarely takes the precautions necessary to ensure that a home doesn't get cross-contaminated. So mold, it's a living, breathing organism that wants to survive. So when you attack it, or it feels like it's being threatened, it will actually shoot off spores. Yes.
Wow.
And the spores are little seeds. They're like little mold babies that are going out to make sure that the species doesn't die off when it's being attacked. And the spores can actually act as a foreign invader to the body. So certain people that have sensitivities, and realistically, it doesn't even require somebody with sensitivities, if there's enough of it, can have an acute reaction, with like headaches, joint aches, respiratory issues, itchy eyes, coughing, even sometimes rashes, things along those lines, so more of an acute reaction. But the thing that most people don't realize is that many molds also release a poisonous substance called a mycotoxin. And myco is the Greek term for fungus. So it not only has survival, techniques built into it, it also has defense mechanisms built into it. So by releasing mycotoxins, it's similar to like a skunk, or a porcupine. When you attack it, it doesn't go very well. So, yeah, a lot of times the way that a general contractor would handle it is by just kind of tearing it out and removing it, but they've just agitated the hornet's nest. And
Right.
now the people that come back into the house don't know why they're sick. And it's because they are combating a invisible enemy with mold spores and mycotoxins that are airborne, but they can't see them.
Yeah. And probably can't
So
smell them either.
in a lot of cases, you can't smell it. Sometimes
No.
you'll get like a microbial volatile organic compound called a MVOC, you know. Sometimes you'll get it, but not always. It's not, it's definitely not 100% of the time. It's probably 50-50. But if it's musty, MUSTY, if it's musty, it's moldy,
Mm.
right? And you can pretty much count on that to be true. If it's musty, it's moldy. So, you know, when you go into like a basement or you go into a room and it's got this earthy smell,
Mm.
I would start looking for, you're going to find a colony of mold every time. I was just in a home a few days ago and I walked in, and as soon as I entered the home, there was a kick to it. I felt like Mike Tyson had just punched me in the face, you know?
Wow.
And the mother, she had three boys, and one of them has been suffering an autoimmune disorder and is going to, you know, a specialist in the area who had recommended my company to come and take a look for mold because he had shown up with high levels of mycotoxins in his body. So
Wow.
they recommended, you know, Mold Solutions to come and take a look and see what was going on. So she had stated, look, I don't see any mold. There's nothing visible. And she probably had gotten used to the smell so much so that she didn't even realize that her home had a musty smell at all,
Right.
you know? So I walk in and, you know, I asked her a little bit of the history of the home. Have there been any sort of water intrusion issues? Have you seen any sort of, you know, suspect growth or organic growth? And she says, no, we haven't seen anything. But there was, you know, in this closet over here, there was some mildew a few months ago. And I said, okay. Um, and I said, so what's your definition of mildew? You know, and she
Mhm.
said, well, there was some, you know, green and white specks on some of my shoes. And I said, well, look, mildew is actually a euphemism for mold.
Mhm.
And that particular type of growth usually comes back as a mold called Aspergillus penicillium. And they look so similar that they can't tell the difference. So they just kind of categorize it. Aspergillus and penicillium is almost like the same
Mm.
together. Okay. But the Aspergillus mold is a very toxic mold. It's actually more toxic than, in many ways, like there's more, and I try not to go dark when it comes to mold, but you know, you can't really avoid it on this. There's more fatalities from Aspergillus than from Stachybotrys chartum, which is the technical term for black mold.
Wow.
So the white mold, Aspergillus, is responsible for more physical problems or fatalities than black mold, just numerically.
And you hear about black mold more often.
And you hear about black mold way more.
Yeah.
And but Aspergillus, what happens is it actually, you can inhale it and the mold spore lands in the body, and the mold spore, what it needs to start growing is water, nutrients, and oxygen.
Mhm.
So the human body has all of those things. So you can actually get, you know, fungal infections in the body, and you can actually
Mhm.
start growing mold in your body.
Oh my.
So that green and white mold is that type of mold. And it was
Wow.
on her shoes. And then I started looking closer, got my flashlight, and it was all up and down her closet on the wall. And
Wow.
she didn't like using her AC. So she set it at around 80. And unfortunately, at that level, the humidity levels don't drop below 60. So all mold needs, that type of mold, it's considered a dry mold.
Mm.
And all it needs is about 60% relative humidity for it to start growing. So it, yeah, it was all over her master bedroom. And then it was in the closet, but the spores themselves are everywhere. If you see
Right.
colonized mold, you're talking about millions and millions of spores that have gotten together and now they're having a party. And
Yeah.
once they get enough water, they go crazy. And it's like, almost adding alcohol to a college frat party, right? It's like they're getting rowdy at that point in time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, if you have dust
So
bunnies in the house, you put and mold, you've got wherever dust bunnies are, you've got mold.
pretty much, right? Because there's enough skin cells and hair and
Yeah.
everything else, and it's enough organic nutrients, it will start growing. So
Wow.
I tell people, look, if you want the simplest version of how to keep your home free and clear of mold, keep it clean and dry.
Hmm.
And if you do those two things, you can, pretty much make sure that you don't wind up with mold. Now, it's more difficult than it sounds because keeping a
Mhm.
home dry is not always an easy task, and you might have invisible or unknown sources of water that people are unaware of. And I'll give you another example. I was in a home 2 days ago where the lady of the home, the mom, she's got a 2-year-old and she's pregnant. So she's, about 5 or 6 months pregnant, I believe. And her husband have had chronic fatigue, headaches. She's not sleeping. It's off and on. And, I came into the home. There was a little bit of a musty smell, not horrendous. Checked the HVAC. Sure enough, there was visible signs of organic growth in the HVAC. She told me about a leak in the kitchen. Looked in there. It looked like there was probably an issue. So I said,
Hmm.
okay, let's start with the HVAC and removing some of the bottom plates on the kitchen cabinets to see if we could avoid removing all of the cabinets. Go ahead.
Hmm. What's the HVAC?
Oh, good question. So HVAC is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning.
Oh, okay.
HVAC. So it's the air conditioning system. So
Okay.
most homes have in Florida, with central heating and air, many of them have what's called a split unit where the
Mhm.
condenser is outside and the air handler or the furnace is usually either in the attic or the garage or in a closet.
Yeah, I think that's what we have too. We have
Yes.
something upstairs and then two units outside.
Yeah. So if you have two condensers outside, then you usually have two air handlers in your
Hmm.
home.
Hmm.
Okay. And so that's where you want to make sure you have your filters. That's where your blower wheel is usually located, and it connects to the ducts
Hmm.
that feed the rooms the cooler, warm air.
Yeah.
Okay. So she had visible growth in her HVAC system, in her air handler, and in her ducts. So we were going to start there. And we did. We started with cleaning the ducts and removing some of the cabinets. And sure enough, once we opened up the cabinets, there was a lot more mold behind the back of the cabinet. So that is going to have to come out. And there was a toxic mold behind those cabinets.
Wow.
But the real source of, I believe, what was the majority of their problem is they had their handyman start removing their luxury vinyl plank in their home. And he got about, 5% into it and starts removing the LVP, and he's seen microbial growth under the luxury vinyl plank.
Hmm.
So what happened is they were trying to save money. So instead of removing the old bamboo flooring, it was a glue down flooring on a concrete slab. So they had the bamboo concrete slab, and then they put the LVP on top of it, the luxury vinyl plank, which
Hmm.
acted as a vapor barrier. It acted as a moisture barrier. So the concrete can get wet. It can
Hmm.
basically wick water up through the
It
concrete.
sweats like a basement does up
It-
north.
exactly. So it can sweat, it can pull water. If the membrane has failed, the vapor barrier below it has failed, or if there's not one, the concrete will pull water out of the earth. So now
Wow.
you have wet concrete, bamboo flooring. If the bamboo flooring was just on the concrete, you probably might wind up with a little bit of a situation, but the wood is a little bit more porous and it breathes and it will release a vapor, and then the AC should keep it dry.
Mm.
But when you put a vapor barrier on top of it, you've now just created like a moldy sandwich. And that's what happened. There's mold all throughout their 3,000 square foot home,
Wow.
and this is once they moved out of the house, all of their symptoms went away.
Huh.
Sleeping better, headaches, all of that gone, right? Chronic runny nose, gone. And so that's going to be a pretty massive project,
Yeah.
but they really don't have an option because otherwise they're basically living in like Chernobyl, right? Where
Yeah.
they're in a not radioactive toxic plant, but a moldy
Yeah.
plant,
Declining.
where it's going to destroy their immune system. And
Wow.
I think that's one of the things that people underestimate is the impact of mold and the gas that mold releases, the mycotoxin, how poisonous it can be. And when you do a little bit of research, you find out that trichothecene, which is one of the mycotoxins, like mold was actually harvested and it was grown during the Persian Gulf War, and it was used as part of the biological weapons. It was used for biological warfare.
Wow.
And it didn't necessarily kill off the American soldiers, but it was used to make them incredibly sick,
Yeah.
which is more taxing on the enemy, the enemy army or military, because now they
Right.
have to care for their sick on top of, they're out of the battle. So it was actually, that's what it was used for.
Wow.
So, you know, when you have these people that are highly sensitive, that are like over the top, I understand why. But the good news is that there are ways to handle it if it's done, the right way, following the correct sequence and making sure that you have all the proper systems in place to remove the contaminated material and basically purify the air. And I'm talking about systems far beyond just like a purification device in your home or in your air handler. There's more that needs to be done once it's there.
Hmm. Yeah, we had ultraviolet thing put in our furnace
Yes.
because
So
go ahead.
yeah, UV light and ultraviolet light is a fantastic addition to any furnace. So I normally recommend having a UV light like on the blower wheel in the
Mm.
coils, and then a purification device, usually in the box that connects the arms, like the ducts,
Mm-hmm.
to the air handler, right? So you would plug in a purification device that does ionization and potentially some UV as well. So there's different ones out on the market, but most people know of the Remy Halo, which is a decent one. So I usually recommend a 2 to 3 prong approach on the air handler to keep it as clean as possible. So you're in San Antonio, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing that you guys get a lot of humidity as well.
Yeah, it can be very humid and then it can be very dry and hot.
Right.
But
So you
yeah,
got different extremes, right?
yeah,
So yeah, during your more humid months, you're having so much moisture. Same here, same thing here. I mean, we're really year round, pretty much, except
right,
for 3 months, we're pretty humid, like over 70% humidity in Tampa
right.
Bay. So, that's it's a difficult task. And one of the things, just as a gift for your audience, they can actually go to moldebook.com, and there's a free download there. So it's a book that I wrote after going through 3,500 homes. And it's called Preventing Mold in a Humid Climate, Mold-Free Living, Preventing Mold in a Humid Climate. So
Mm.
it's about a 2-hour read. It's not very long. It's pretty A to B, but it's got 15 pointers, 15 sort of action tips to prevent mold,
What's the name
despite
of it
the,
again?
it's mold-free living, right? How to prevent mold in a humid climate. But the website is really easy. It's a free download. It's moldebook.com.
Okay, thank you.
Moldebook.com. So they can go there, and it covers all of these points. Like, what are the ideal settings, especially in a humid climate, for your HVAC? The HVAC, it has two functions. One is to climatize the air. That's number one, make it more comfortable for us. But number two, it's actually to pull water out of the air.
Hmm.
So, that's a massive dehumidifier that's in your
Yeah.
home. So in Tampa, like when it gets to the cold part of the year, you want your AC set between like 70 and 74, maybe 69, but you want it to kick on at least once a day. And you could also go to the heater, and kind of that will help to dry things out as well. Adding heat and airflow to the environment will help to dry things out. But in the summer, you really don't want to go below 75, between 75 and 78. So some people that were like, okay, I'm going to keep my home as cool and dry as possible, they'll set it at 69. And before you know it, their ducts are sweating, their, vents are dropping water droplets,
Hmm.
and there is a lot of condensation, running through their home because
Hmm.
of, the certain material in the home hitting dew point. So now it's collecting water droplets on that surface. So the book goes over kind of what are the Goldilocks settings of
Hmm.
the HVAC. It talks about UV light, it talks about purification devices, it talks about, crawl spaces, how to potentially, because a lot of the air that you breathe, if you have a space below your home that's like earth and then subfloor and there's 2 feet, you can about 50% of the air you breathe is coming from your crawl space. So what can you do to improve that air quality?
Yeah.
You know,
I remember back in Iowa, we had a 4-room house initially, and we had crawl space under there. And then we always had mice in the house, always.
yes,
And you could hear them running through the walls and stuff. And I think,
yes,
you tear a wall out and there's all this mouse poop and stuff, and the stench of
yes,
it was
yes,
a weird smell,
yes,
a dried up death, if you will,
yeah.
it was
Well,
weird.
sometimes that's what you have, right? Is they actually do, that's what can happen with, especially if
Yeah.
there's entrance points.
Yeah.
So the, there's a benefit to those old homes, which is there's a couple benefits, three right off the top of my head. One is they were more drafty.
Hmm.
So there's more of an exchange of fresh air.
Right.
Two, the timber being an older timber, they used to build with an older timber, was less cellulose.
Hmm.
The young timber is more cellulose, and mold loves that more porous type of material,
Yeah.
right? And then the other thing is that a lot of the older homes were built with plaster,
Yeah.
and plaster, mold does not like plaster. It
Huh,
doesn't
that's
like
interesting.
it's more of a rock, plus it is less acidic, right?
Hmm.
Where mold loves the drywall, which is more acidic, and it's also got a paper,
Yeah.
surface as well, right?
Yeah.
So, the older homes, although a lot of people think, oh, an old home's going to have more mold, it's not always the case,
Yeah.
and a lot of times we'll see new construction, especially here, people are trying to save money on materials. They are building with, OSB or some, OSB planks that might have glue in it.
Hmm.
Well, glue is an organic material. They're trying to build year round. You get a lot of rains. So
Hmm.
anytime you get water, glue, wood, that's like a moldy mess waiting to happen. So then they might build on top of that. It's not completely dry and there's mold on it. And then you get enough, vapor transfer that occurs, and that mold will activate and it will start releasing spores and mycotoxins. It will start off gassing and people can get sick from it. I've
Yeah.
seen entire apartment complexes where they did not do the stucco right. They did not do the waterproofing right. And they had to remove all of the stucco because as soon as you walked in there, it was extremely musty and all of the tenants were getting sick. So there's a huge
I,
amount of liability.
I've heard so much about the military homes on the bases and stuff, just full of mold. And I think, how can you do that to our soldiers and their families?
Look,
It's
I'll tell you, you just struck a chord with me. You just struck a chord because, I'm not going to name the base, but
there's
what
more
was
than
it?
one, I'm sure.
Yeah, I guess it was probably 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago for me. Um, there was a particular family that was extremely sick, right? And it was on one of the military bases. And, I reached out to the lady and said, look, we can help. And I thought that there was going to be sort of a strong embrace of our willingness to help. And I definitely got snubbed, if you will, right? And I probably didn't take it from the right angle. You know, maybe if I had gone through the property management company rather than going directly to the person that was in the home. But her story was such that it really kind of struck a chord with me because my son got sick from mold when he was young, when he was a month old, and I got sick from mold in 2019. So I wanted to help. And I knew that we had a system in terms of the atomized sanitization that was really a crucial element to doing a proper mold treatment. So, you know, I reached out to her, and she had already moved off the base, but the family was still getting sick. So I said, look, well, and I reached out to her, and she said, I don't think I can afford your services. We've already spent so much money. I said, your husband's service is enough, right? So we ended up
Oh, that's so sweet.
treating the entire home, and it made a huge difference in terms of the kids having a reaction, and it was a different scene. So she recommended me to a lot of her friends that were still on the base. So the base was the private company that was overseeing the base operations was not interested in having any sort of conversation. And unfortunately, because it's a federal land, they don't have to follow some of the rules that we have here in Florida and the passing standards. And really, there's not a official government body that has an official passing standard. So it's almost like this nebulous, like, well, was it done to an acceptable standard? Well, we don't know, but we remediated. But
Depends
then
on the
if
standard.
depends on whose standard, right? But there's no standard. So, but what was being done is through the remediation process, they were actually creating a lot of dust. But then when you test the dust, it was actually a toxic dust. It was chatomium all over everything because they were sanding the floors that had mold on it. And the floors were OSB. So what was occurring was there was the hot, humid air moving up into these homes that were on pillars. And there was a tremendous colonization of chatomium that was growing on the subfloor and getting behind the cabinets, getting under the LVP. And then they were ripping up the floors, sanding it, and then the people were getting worse.
Yeah.
And you literally had soldiers and officers that survived 2, maybe 3 tours overseas in the Middle East. They were coming home and were now debilitated because of the exposure to mold and mycotoxins. And they weren't even thinking with mold or mycotoxins. They weren't thinking with mold spores or mycotoxins at all, like zero. You know, so it's one of these things. You're absolutely right that there's a tremendous amount of misinformation and potentially turning a blind eye or not digging in to the actual root cause, what's actually causing the problem, and fixing it, because it can also be it can be very expensive when you're having to rebuild a structure, take a structure down and then rebuild it. And then also doing almost like a chemical cleanup, which is really what it requires to get a home to a point where it's safe and healthy again. You're really having to do like a chemical cleanup on the home, because it's not just the colonized growth that you're trying to remove, it's the spores and the mycotoxins that are microscopic.
Yeah, you displace them, they're going to find a home somewhere else. Any little, it's just.
And the poison, right? Like it's the poison that mold releases to defend its territory. So you go in on a head first attack, you know, like you're going to get rid of it, you're going to attack it, you're going to sand it. Well, what have you just done? You've just put it under extreme stress, and it's now going into defense mode, and it's poisoning the people that are attacking it and the people that come behind afterwards to live there.
See, I like the way you think, because you saying that makes me feel like we're a living being. well, so are they. And if we are
Exactly.
attacked, we come out with all kinds of ammunition and
Yes.
whatever. And so that's what they're doing. They're just trying to survive like we try, but we don't seem to live in harmony very well.
Well, the mold's been here a lot longer than we have,
Yeah,
and that's the thing to keep in mind, right? Is that,
yeah,
and it serves a purpose,
yeah,
and it is to decompose. And when you have, garbage and you have organic matter and, everything else, like imagine if there wasn't decomposing that would take place, right?
yeah.
The landfills would be so much, larger and higher and miles high. So mold serves a strong purpose. The problem is that when it gets into your home
Mm,
and it gets into your building envelope and it's doing its thing, it's highly toxic, especially with these more energy efficient buildings. It's like basically taking a car and turning it on and putting it in the garage and closing the doors.
yeah,
If it's not an electric vehicle, that's a really bad idea because you're going to
yeah,
have carbon monoxide poisoning.
right.
So it's not that different. When you have colonized mold, you know, you're going to have off-gassing in a highly energy efficient, airtight building envelope where that toxic air is just recirculating and recycling through the building. And the people that are living in it are basically being poisoned. So that's why it's so important that if there is a flood, if there is a water damage or, sink that overflows or a toilet that overflows, that it's properly dried out. And really, you have to make sure you have to use meters that detect way beyond the human touch or the naked eye,
Mm,
because if it's over 20% moisture content, fungus can start developing, like zero question about it. But with
mm,
20% moisture content is dry to the touch. You can't feel
right.
it, you
Yeah.
know. So you have to dry it out, and you also have to put your detective hat on to really determine where the water is coming from. I had one client who had migraine headaches for 2 years that had completely debilitated her. And she was very well off. Her husband had put together a company that was a unicorn company, like $1 billion company. Okay.
Mm,
Like incredible growth. But his wife was sick and she had migraines that would not go away. But despite their wealth, they were very frugal
mm,
and they did not have an opulent sort of lifestyle at all. So I came into the home and, they were, I think Danish or Holland or one of these countries where they had a different system. So she asked me to take my shoes off, which was very serendipitous.
mm,
And because I'm walking through the different rooms and I get to the master bedroom and the carpet just felt a little bit moist to the
mm.
touch. Okay. So I said, oh, you know what? That feels a little bit wet, just a little tiny bit damp. So I got, on my hands and knees and looked under the bed, put a flashlight on, and she had these wood slats. Her bed was on these wood slats and it was fuzzy.
Huh?
The wood slats were completely fuzzy, but they were white. So you couldn't see it. If you would have looked, you would never have seen it if it didn't have a flashlight.
Wow.
But there was a massive nest of aspergillosis. It was under her
Oh,
bed.
oh my.
So we obviously got rid of the bed, handled the fact that there was carpet in that room and that the slab was not properly sealed,
Ugh.
and the migraines went away. So it really, people talk about, well, look, if it's not black mold, it's probably not that big of a concern, right?
Mhm.
It's not something to be too worried about. But I can tell you right now, the green mold, the white mold, the brown mold, the black mold, the purple mold, the orange mold, none of those molds are molds that you want in your home. There's no
Right.
good mold in your home because the majority of them do release a mycotoxin.
Yeah.
You know, the mold
Wow.
that inhabits the AC unit, it's called cladosporium. Cladosporium thrives in a cold, wet environment. And that's exactly what an AC unit is. It's a cold, wet environment, and it thrives in that environment. Yet it releases a mycotoxin. It causes rashes, skin issues, upper respiratory issues, right? All kinds of stuff. So it's really important that if people are experiencing chronic physical ailments or non-optimum physical issues, that they look to see if mold may be the culprit, because a lot of these mysterious, issues might actually be related to mycotoxin exposure and then basically living in a home that's making them sick.
Unbelievable. Just wow. I always thought it was the black mold was the issue, but yeah, like you say, any mold, but it's so like I have an allergy to mold, but there's so many kinds I don't remember what kind. I also have allergy to cat. And I used to work in an allergy office and I'd give myself shots for it, and I'd walk around with this big old red welt for 3 days, and I still am allergic to cats. So I said, heck with it, I'm gonna bother. And I go outside and I love to play in the dirt. And you can smell, the decomposition of it and stuff. And I like the smell of it, but now it makes me think, what am I doing? Smelling mold?
It's
But
possible, right?
but it's like it's to the point where it's good dirt, soil, I should say, not just dirt. But when it breaks down, that way. But yeah, I've seen some wood chips that are moldy looking.
Of course. I mean,
Yeah.
look, if it's organic,
Yeah.
there's a very good chance that mold is going to grow on it. All it needs is, water, oxygen, and nutrients, and it loves organic material, leather, paper, um, you
Yeah.
know, all kinds of stuff, skin,
Well, I have to applaud all the different kinds of mold. They are very smart compared to
yes.
humans. We think we're so smart, but I think we're about the dumbest species out there, because we don't survive nearly as long as mold. Maybe the mama mold doesn't live as long, but mama's product does.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
and without mold and all the different ways of breaking things down, the earth would be way too heavy by now.
That's right. It'd be way more heavier. So it really is. It does serve a purpose, but it's even talked about in the Bible. There's like a remediation process in the Bible itself in regards to, how you handle it and what you need to do if it comes back after a certain number of days. But it basically talks about pretty much burning down the structure if it comes back. So it kind of puts it in perspective how severe the Bible considers it to be. But at the end of the day, you don't have to burn down the building. The approach that we recommend, it is a thorough approach, and it is important that each step is done, especially when it's coming to health concerns. But you really want to make sure, number one, that you contain off the area that has the mold, because you're going to need to remove it, especially if it's a water mold. It's not a dry mold. If it's a dry mold, you may not need to remove the moldy material. You can just remove the mold itself. And you remove the mold itself through HEPA vacuuming. HEPA stands for high efficiency particulate air filter. So there's certain vacuums that specifically address, these tiny particles and do not exhaust as well. So you would set up the containment, have air control. So you want to put the building under negative air, so you're blowing the bad air out the window or out the door. You usually would duct that to like a fan or a air filtration device. Okay. And then once you have that set up, the containment, and you've engineered the air, you would then cut out the contaminated material, or then remove the dry mold if it's just surface, on the surface due to humidity. And then after you remove it, you treat the structural material itself. Like sometimes you can't remove the structural material, so you have to sand it or treat it. And that's why it's so important that you do that under negative air, so that you're not, cross-contaminating the rest of the house, and why you have to have like the dust walls up when you're doing that. And then after you've done the full removal and you've treated the structure, you then want to HEPA-vac that entire room, starting from the top down. And then you would want to do a full wipe down of that same room using an antimicrobial damp wipe. And then you would HEPA-vac it one more time, or
Wow.
potentially you would use a microfiber rag, which has a static charge to it. Brand new microfiber rags that have a static charge. And then once you've done all of that, I would strongly recommend doing a whole home sanitization using an atomized sanitization process. There's certain products that will actually break down and dissolve mycotoxins. Usually it's a citric acid or a vinegar, which are both acidic, and it helps to actually break down mycotoxins and dissolve mycotoxins. So there is a full sequence of actions that one would take, and also duct cleaning fits in there too. So truthfully, I would not just sanitize the area that is under containment. I would sanitize that area and the entire home and do duct cleaning. So the duct cleaning would come before you do the micro cleaning. In terms of the HEPA-vac and the wipe down, you would do a duct cleaning and then seal that vent up, and then do the HEPA-vac and the microfiber rag, HEPA-vac and then wipe down microfiber rag. So you're basically removing these microscopic particles, these invisible particles. They truly are invisible. If you are seeing it with the naked eye, you're not looking at a mold spore, right? If you're seeing visual colonized mold, that's colonized growth that has now spread its roots and has gotten furry and fuzzy, or potentially sometimes it's kind of almost slimy. It's like yeah. But the mold spores are, 7.5 microns. The naked eye stops seeing it 40 microns.
So if you're seeing this blob of mold, it's all these spores that have congregated and multiplied.
Yes.
Wow.
Multiplied and, spread its roots.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I hear a lot is, oh, it's Florida. Every home has mold. Oh, don't worry about that. It's just that old Florida smell, like these types of things. And they're really just sort of glib answers and euphemisms that are sort of put off on the public to try to disarm them or, make it so that they're not alarmed or concerned. But the unfortunate part about that is that they now don't think it's an issue when it's actually making them sick.
Yeah.
So they have this false sense of security or this false peace of mind when they potentially are living in a very dangerous environment. And for some people, they may be more sensitive to others. So for some people, it could actually be debilitating. For others, it may just be annoying. So every person's immune system is different.
Right.
And you have to basically really, you want to err on the side of caution and safety and make sure that that home was safe for, it kind of breaks down where 80% or 75% of the population is usually not that sensitive, but they may get an acute reaction if they are in a highly exposed or highly contaminated environment. And 25% of the populace have a particular gene mutation, which actually prevents them from detoxing at the same level. Okay. And those people have a stronger reaction. It can be pretty dangerous for them.
Yeah.
And about 2% of the populace is extremely hypersensitive, and it is highly debilitating for them. Like they're wrecked if they're in a moldy environment. So, you have to think with that, you might have 3-4 people in a family and only one of them is reacting. And it's just in their head. It's not just they're crazy. No, they actually might have a gene mutation that prevents them from detoxing.
And so you go to the doctor with all these horrible migraines and they give you a pill.
And that's a massive situation, not just, in, the allergy sensitivity arena, but really in general.
Yeah.
We've become, as a society as a whole, accustomed to cutting the check engine light, right? Because the body is giving us different indicators or feedback letting us know there's a problem. And if you just kind of cut the check engine light, you're not solving the problem.
Right.
You're just making it so you're not potentially seeing it or feeling it. But there's a bigger issue at hand. So we need to kind of start really, I think, as a whole, looking for root cause and what's actually the thing that is creating the problem in the first place. And if you can find the right reason behind the problem, then you are no longer in a position where you're dependent upon a pill or a drug to mask the problem.
Exactly. Mask it, cover it up, mask it, and come on, who's next? Next in line, just,
Correct.
yep, drug them and dump them.
It's a good business, in terms
For
of
the one that's selling the
financially for
product.
your
Yeah,
pocket, but not good for your moral compass or being able to sleep at night.
right.
That then leads you to another business which profits off of mycotoxins, which is, your margaritas and your alcohol and your
Mm.
fermentation of, yeast
Oh, yeah.
and fermentation of fungus. So
Uh,
there's a big business when it comes to mycotoxins and consuming them. It makes you feel a certain way after
It leads
you
down to
take it.
quite the deep rabbit hole, doesn't it?
It does, but
Wow.
anybody that says that, oh, mold's not a big deal, well, how do you feel after you've had a 12 pack of beer, or for some
Yeah.
people even just 2 beers, or a whiskey, or how about LSD, right? The drug of choice back in the 60s with
Yeah.
the hippies, right? And they were popping LSD tabs. Well, where did that come from? That was from a ergot, fungus. It was that's where that poison comes from. It's actually a mold. Or how
Yeah.
about magic mushrooms?
Oh, yeah, I've heard
What
of
is it?
them.
It's a fungus,
Yeah.
right? So, you know, sometimes it can be a bad trip. Sometimes it can be, I guess, a good trip, but what you're doing is you're basically consuming a poison and the body is reacting. So it's not just physical, like the mold and the mycotoxins and the fungus exposure. It's not just physical problems. It actually leads to mental health issues. It leads to depression. It can lead to split personality issues. Like there's a article in Psychology Today, where there was one of the psychiatrists that was talking about a lot of the labels and the different syndromes could be environmentally triggered, and it actually may be mold at the bottom of it.
Oh,
So you just have to look up on Google Psychology Today mold and mycotoxins, and you'll find the articles from 2017. But why isn't that being talked about more? Why isn't potentially the ADHD or the ADD or whatever these different symptoms? How do you know that the child is not in a moldy environment?
yeah.
They're consuming poisons and toxins. It may be leading to brain fog or an inability to focus.
Yeah,
How
like
about,
no water.
right?
Who
Like,
would think that unless somebody had tested, Yeah,
right,
because we trust the sources or the powers that be that are to protect us, and they're paid for. They're bought off
right.
for their silence.
And it's a big business, right? And you don't
Yeah,
really
it
want
is.
to, as soon as and look, some people, once you start getting to first they're going to ignore you,
Mm.
right? And they pretend you don't exist
And then say your
until
name.
you
Ooh.
start having an impact on their profits. And once they start seeing that you're having a big enough impact on their profits, they'll go after you,
Yeah.
right? And there will be character assassination that takes
Oh,
place, right? So there's
yeah.
a whole system
To
in
shut you
place
down.
to
Yeah.
protect the castle and to
Right.
protect the coffers,
Right.
right? But at the end of the day, we have a duty to protect ourselves and protect our family. And the way to do that is through, correct knowledge and correct information and
Exactly.
informing oneself. And really, that's where the mother's intuition and, the moms play such a crucial role in making sure that the home is protected from things that may actually cause health risk. Because a lot of times, you know, and I hate to say it, you know, as a dad, I wasn't thinking with mold as a potential culprit causing the problems, you know, and I was very lucky that I had just gotten into the remediation
Mm.
industry and the mold industry, you know, a few months before my son was born,
Huh.
and had gotten certification and gotten trained. So when he was having like an asthma attack, you know, very similar to an asthma attack, 3 days in a row, you know, and my wife was ready to take him to the emergency room, I said, look, let me just make sure that it's not environmental. It doesn't
Wow.
make sense, right? So I put on my detective hat and started looking around and turned this one shelving system that we'd gotten a few months earlier. And it literally was 2 feet high of mold, 2 feet wide of mold.
Oh my
And
God.
basically what had happened is my mom had come to visit because of the baby, right? Her first grandchild.
Right.
And, you know, she was, you know, taking a shower every day, not knowing, and we didn't know because it was a guest bathroom, that there was a pinhole leak in that particular shower, which was behind that wall. So the water was dripping down the wall or spraying down the wall,
Oh.
and then it was growing up this, you know, shelving system. And the air handler was located in that same room. It was in a closet in that room.
Mm.
So it was basically pulling that moldy, poisonous air and distributing it throughout the rest of the house. So my wife and I were okay, but my son, you know, at a month old, was obviously his immune system hadn't developed yet,
Yeah.
and he's taking more breaths than we were, right? He was really having a rough
Yeah.
time, you know.
Wow.
So the good news is that with the training and certification I had, you know, we fixed the leak, removed the contaminated material, did a full micro cleaning on the house, and then sanitized the home using the non-toxic product. And it's really atomizing it that it's plays such a crucial role, because the particles are so tiny that they don't splatter, they just bounce around.
Mm.
And, you know, it basically will break down the toxins, right? So my wife and my son were back in 3 hours after everything was done. And the next morning he slept an hour longer with no trouble breathing at all. And that
Wow.
was really my first kind of moment where I was like, wow,
Yeah.
this is really important. This is not just a business. This is a mission,
Yeah.
you know, to really kind of help educate people and change the way that this is looked at. Because I
Right.
looked at what would have occurred had I not known
Right.
that, had my wife
Right.
not known that, and how traumatizing that would have been for him in terms of the testing and, you know, going through all of this at
Lifelong.
a month old. And
Yeah.
they wouldn't have found the actual cause of it,
No, they wouldn't have. And he'd been a
right?
sick kid forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just getting
So,
worse. Yeah.
yeah, so really it's important, you know, for your listeners, that if there are physical symptoms, and obviously I'm a mold guy, I'm not a doctor, but I've dealt with and have interviewed some of the best in this area, which happen to, you know, Tampa, we have a lot of the best in the US
Mm.
for treating mold toxicity. It really is something that it may not be like, I don't want it to be like, oh, it must be mold. Look, it may not be mold, but definitely make sure that that stone does not go unturned. Like, you really want to look and make sure that it's not. And you find an inspector that knows what they're doing. Find an
Mm.
inspector that knows where to look, what to look for. You know, air samples are not an end all be all. Okay. Air samples can be inaccurate 70% of the time. You know, find an inspector that knows where to look, what to look for, can spot mold with just a flashlight alone,
Mm.
right? Like somebody who really knows their stuff,
Right.
to do a deep dive on your home, who's going to use moisture meters, who's going to check for water intrusion issues, who's going to check the perimeter of the house, who's going to do direct samples, not just air samples, but is actually going to swab anything that looks concerning.
Wow.
And hey, you might even want to call in a mold sniffing canine, you know, because the mold dogs are pretty accurate. You know,
Oh,
I'd say they're
yeah.
probably like 90% accurate, where the air samples are about 30% accurate.
Wow. And
So
then
I
the
would
dog could go to the spot that's
Yes,
contaminated. Oh my gosh.
definitely the cutest option that there is,
Yeah.
you know. But yes, the mold sniffing dog is not a bad way to go, you know.
Wow.
But I also would recommend kind of a combination
Oh, yeah.
to really know kind of that you are in the clear, right?
Yeah.
And that you are in a place that is, you know, not, you know, contaminated. Because I've been in homes that were immaculate, you would never guess it,
Mm.
and they were highly toxic,
Wow.
highly toxic. So, and the amount of black mold that we found behind walls, you know, and yeah, and in the HVAC unit, like so much mold that you pull the HVAC panel and it's like incredibly moldy, you know.
Mm.
I had one client where it's ironically a clinic for treating people with mold toxicity, but at least 3 of the doctors in the clinic had called me out to their house. And, you know, I found a little bit going on at their home. We did some handlings, but then they were still like, I don't know, it's not a complete handling. Well, the clinic ended up,
Being the
there
problem.
was being the problem. And
Wow.
they'd even done a test, in an ERMI test, and they had done a test. And, but when we pulled up, what happened is the toilet overflowed
Mm.
and they pulled up the LVP, and the contractor laid the LVP down on the concrete directly. There was no sealing the concrete. There was no vapor barrier. And there was a ton of microbial growth
Mm.
under the luxury vinyl plank. And then once we opened up the HVAC units, there was a bunch of mold behind the actual panels on the insulation. You know, there's a particular HVAC system that is notorious for the insulation. It's like a black rubber insulation growing mold on it.
Wow.
And they had 3 of those systems in their clinic covered in mold. And you know, it's no wonder that they were all experiencing
Yeah.
symptoms that were related to mold exposure.
Oh, Brandon, this has just been fascinating. We could go on for hours, but I think we need to end it and maybe revisit. But you know, I am just so pleased that you wanted to be on my podcast and that I accepted it. It just it's a different spin. You know, like I said, I'm a health advocate, but definitely mold is so important, so important.
It is. It's important to know, you know, and
Yeah.
I might have taken up more time. I go on a roll sometimes. I don't even
Yeah,
know
well, I
like that.
understand, me too.
Yeah, yeah.
But I really appreciate you taking your time to talk to my viewers, and I hope that several of them, if not all of them, take advantage of your information and at least look at your ebook. It was moldebook.com, correct?
Moldebook.com, that's right. And also, you know, they can find us moldsolutions.com. That's an
Okay.
easy one to remember, moldsolutions.com. And also on Instagram, my wife helps with the social media, mold.solutions. And you'll see my son and my daughter there. My son, Boston, he's 6 years old. He's doing great.
Good.
And, you know, yeah, so they help us with they're like little mold inspectors too at this point in time. So.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And I'd like to thank our viewers for tuning in and listening. And stay tuned because we'll have more incredible interviews. So, bye-bye. Thank you for tuning in to my Common Sense Living podcast today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm sure you learned something new. Please leave a kind review and share this episode with a friend. And be sure to subscribe yourself. You'll find me on iTunes, Spotify, and other platforms. And don't forget, we'll be here again next week with another insightful episode of Common Sense Living. I can hardly wait.